Chapter 12. Butcher. Sebastian, if you have a minute, come down to the black box after dinner. Sebastian nodded, his mouth full as I passed him. If I wanted to see Violetta tomorrow throw knives with her, I would need help with the paperwork. For a moment I considered asking Armand to help, but if I saw him again so recently, since he kidnapped her to make use of her fluffy sweater, I'd probably beat him up instead. I didn't have time to waste on that. Orion, could I have a word?
I glansde over at Toby.
I didn't sigh, only nodded and walked slower so he could keep up with me. He looked tired, with dark circles under his eyes. What can I do for you, Butcher? It's Mal. They're going to bring him back to Calder. Let him resume his classes like he didn't betray us. It's bad enough about Tansetta when we all know he's a renegade traitor, but Mal tried to kill you. It's wrong to let him go free. Mal seemed to be completely recovered from the vampire's effects, other than mental health. All the same, he would be escorted to classes. Who would perform that duty? I hadn't entirely decided yet. I turned to Toby and gave him a sympathetic smile while I put my hand on his shoulder. He straightened up a little bit and lifted his head. You raise an excellent point. The truth is that there are so few butchers who I can completely rely on. I'm so glad to know that you are loyal to the end. With Mal, it's essential that we treat him as kindly as possible, all while watching vigilantly for any traces of darkness. If he is used again by the enemy, we need to be ready to attack first this time. I'll need a team of my best to watch over him, guard him even from himself if it becomes necessary. Could you form an escort team to protect Mal? He nodded soberly. Of course, Orion. Mal won't like it. You'll have to be subtle. Mal doesn't have close friends, but over time you can win his trust. And hopefully Toby would be worthy of it. Where is Andy? He frowned like he had no idea who I was talking about. Oh, he's around here somewhere. I narrowed my eyes and studied Toby more closely. What I should do was track down the mischief Andrew and Toby were getting into before it caused some trouble down the line, but I had work to do. I would have Francis keep an eye on things. If only I could be sure that Francis wouldn't take whatever they were doing up a notch. I smiled and squeezed his shoulder before I turned and headed to the garage. Had no time to waste. I drove west to a little shop in a strip mall. Odin's Trousers, the sign read, with tailor extraordinary in small words beneath that. Put up the roof because it looked like rain, sleet, or something else miserable. I headed into the shop, the annoying buzz sounding at my arrival. What are you doing here? The man behind the counter glared at me, a deep gash long-heeled across his face and notching his nose and through what used to be an eye. What happened to your last two coats? I looked down at my current coat. Nothing. I'm not here for me. I walked to the counter, put Violetta's sweater down and looked at him expectantly. He picked it up, the frown on his discolored face truly horrific. Ah, you want to make your baker a nice gift. Come back. I went through the side door with warning, no customers allowed beyond this point sign. I walked through the narrow passageway to the large room and back, filled with tailor forms in various states of undress. How's your coat holding up? Odin asked, circling me. Great as always. I think the interior pocket might be pulling a bit. Probably shouldn't put my cleaver in that one. He snorted and pushed me over to a woman's form. The waist and bust were clearly different from the other forms. The sweater doesn't help that much without a body to go with it. Do you have specs for the coat? She wants wool, soft and with lots of buttons. He stared at me for a second. Do you have a picture of this girl? I stared back at him. No, how was it possible that I didn't have a picture? Of Violetta? He rolled his eyes. Butchers. Not a romantic bone in your body. Show me where she comes up to on you. I put my hand on my chest, higher, lower, then settled somewhere close to my collarbone. Broad shoulders? Bust. She has a lovely bust. He actually laughed. I'd never seen him laugh before, so that was terrifying. All right. Let's say between your mother and Lottie Vespetti, which is she? More like. I shook my head. Neither. She's a gymnast. Lithe, slender, light, small-boned. And delicate in feature and figure. Ah. A little fairy maid? No wonder you're so smitten you can't take a photo of her. I should just put more reinforcing in your inside pocket so you can carry her around in there. He turned and picked up an enormous pair of shears. I swallowed. I'm not certain that she would approve of that. I personally Love the idea. He laughed again and turning snipped my hair. A good 2 inches. I stood still while he walked around me, snipping here and there until he was apparently finished. Such a strange and deadly tailor. No butcher I have. Just the thing in mind. Ruffles tailored but soft. What color are her eyes? Pale green. He stepped back and threw the shears onto the table. Landry's daughter? Joey. Was a lucky cuss getting her to marry him. He seemed to make her happy. Though, Landry couldn't make anyone happy. He seems to work for the CM all right. I couldn't listen to someone talk bad about Landry. He was the greatest baker we could ask for. He sniffed. Don't get touchy, butcher. Would you marry him? That's all I'm saying. Not that he asked her. Fool. You won't make the same mistake. I blinked at him. Getting a woman pregnant and then letting another man raise my children? No. I think I can safely say that isn't one of the mistakes I'll make. You say you have the coat for her. He laughed again. I shuddered and tried to smile pleasantly. He shouldn't laugh. I have it here, he said, tapping his head. It'll be ready in a few weeks. In time for Christmas, certainly. I'll call Landry for her exact measurements. I don't suppose you'll let me keep this, he said, lifting the sweater. He threw it at me before I could take out a knife. Such a touchy butcher. You should probably get some sleep one of these nights. Man cannot live on baker's bread alone. All right, get out. I turned to leave, but then something landed on my head. I knew the weight of a butcher coat. I picked it off me and stared at it, the warm brown color of it. The length, the shoulders width, all completely wrong. What's this? Your brother's. Take it to him. It's been cluttering up my shop long enough. Get out. I half turned but then only shook my head and left the tailor. I would be seeing my brother after all. Armand was face down on his bed, surrounded by an assortment of empty bottles. I threw the coat on him. He came up snarling but unbalanced by the weight of the coat. He stared at it, then squinted at me. What's this? Odin told me to take it to you. I would never refuse him, particularly when. He laughed 3 times. Odin laughed. He cursed and collapsed back down under the coat. I towed him with my boot. You took Violetta to the Greek. I'm feeling like you need to hurt. I hurt, he muttered. I sighed and squatted down, poking him with a knife through the coat. It's not as fun when it's self-inflicted. I almost bit her. She's been feeding off me. I didn't think she could, but the hunger and then the other hunger, and you should chop off my head. Probably. I stared at the lump under the coat, his stocking feet sticking out the bottom. You're really pathetic. So she's been feeding off you, does that mean she's been feeding you? The lump shrugged. Yeah, she gives me muffins. It's uncomfortable. I can't be a butcher. But the instincts come alive and then I'm feeling protective and what's with the Greek? He has a thing for her. I didn't think what he is could have a thing for anyone, but he sees her potential for destruction and just, I don't know. He loves the fact that sweet fluffy little bunny girl could level you without blinking, and you'd let her do it so happily. I shrugged and sat all the way down on the disgusting floor. It was littered with auburn fur and other things I didn't want to look at too closely. Shall I kill him? The lump shrugged again. I don't think she'd like that. He gives her bad pizza and listens to her talk about you. It's revolting. I don't know how he can do it without puking. I thumped him with the knife handle. It can't be that bad. Oh, it is. And he's so wonderful and amazing, and he feels like life flowing into me, making everything worthwhile. And that's the mild stuff. When the Greek starts talking about your swirling coat and hair, it's less nauseating. Mostly because I know that he just wants to eat you. He wouldn't eat me. He can't. I don't have fear. No. He sat up, the coat falling off his face, revealing his saggy eyes and messy hair. You're not afraid of losing your sweet little cream puff? Of her realizing that you're nothing but a cold-blooded killer, and she'd be better off with a Greek who can at least have some kind of emotional attachment to her. You didn't say you. He snorted. She's a baby. You posed as her boyfriend. He grinned and wiped his face. Yeah, she didn't like that. I didn't either. Too close to her and she smells like you. I smell better than you. He laughed. Not hard to do, little brother. You know, I stopped aging when I turned. In a few years you'll be older than me. I can't get used to it. Seeing you all big and gloomy all the time. You used to be little and gloomy all the time. I sighed and pushed him back down, throwing the coat back over his face. Get some rest. You're just afraid of what she'll do when she realizes that her friend Armand is actually a werewolf. She might stop giving you muffins. He growled but didn't disagree. But at least she'd stop leaning in front of you with her skin exposed or taking your energy. Why did you ask Odin to make you a butcher's coat? 7 years ago. I forgot all about that. I was going to look so cool in this thing. It's very pimping. He sat up suddenly, throwing off the coat and scowling at me. You're getting a coat from Odin for Vanilla. I nodded. Is that so strange? She's not a butcher, Orion. She's a baker. She's not even a baker. She's a girl who needs family. She needs soft and fluffy and cute. Odin's all about reinforced pockets, shock absorption and stain resistance from zombie guts. I shrugged. Odin said he'd put on some ruffles. Armand groaned. Be careful or Casper is going to steal your girl. I scowled at him. I would love to, but she's not my girl. How close did you come to biting her? If I hadn't eaten something in the next 5 minutes, I would have eaten her. No, I would have run off and eaten something else. Making her a werewolf would be even crueler than I'm capable of being. I exhaled. He didn't really sound all that close. I come closer than that. Not that my bite would turn her into a werewolf, but still. I studied him. Why not? Do you like her that much? He looked at me like I was an idiot. You think I'm going to turn my brother's girl? No. She's not my girl. He rolled his eyes. Oh, she is. She's been pining for you for months. Phew. Were a different kind of person, you could very easily convince her to spend the night in your bed regularly. I smiled at him. She spends every night in my bed. It was not as easy as you might think. His eyes glimmered. She's thinking of getting a mattress pad. Complained that butcher's beds aren't soft enough. Noted. I won't ask Odin to supply one. No? He'll put ruffles on it. We both laughed and for a second I forgot that I'd come to kill him. I'm behind in my reports. Burn them, he answered with a grin. I rolled my eyes but smiled back at him. That won't tell me how many vampires I killed. Apparently I don't notice the little details like that. Just then the door opened and Landry stalked in with his white shirt sleeves rolled up, a spiked rolling pin in one hand, a butcher's knife in the other. Armand's house was an enormous Gothic atrocity, like a little ominous cousin to Candlestick Manor. Unlike the manor, it wasn't fenced and the large yard was filled with wolves, but that wouldn't stop an angry baker. I personally backed away from Armand while my brother rolled to his feet and held up his hands. You've been feeding her? Landry's voice was a low growl as he stalked towards Armand. I wasn't sure what to do. What was the protocol for an angry baker attacking a pack leader? No idea. I should watch. Definitely not get involved. If I hurt Landry, I couldn't even contemplate that idea. What if Armand bit Landry? Would watch closely, make sure Armand kept his teeth away. I could throw a knife before Armand's teeth closed. Probably. I furtively took out my phone and texted. Yeah, the little cream puff keeps sniffing around me. Likes to put her hands on me. What can I say? Landry leapt forward and swung his pin at Armand's head, but Armand caught it in his suddenly long jaws before leaping away. Armand was shifting between wolf and butcher with more precision than I'd ever seen before. Was Violetta's feeding him doing other things than making him hungry for her? You can say that you're a bloody werewolf, you filthy beast. Landry sliced up with the cleaver, catching Armand's shirt even as he twisted away flexibly. I hadn't really seen Landry fight before. He was good, fast, precise, and Armand got beaten fairly well, but I could see Armand start to lose control. To get angry. That wouldn't do. Armand had been trained from his first steps to respect the baker. Without that reserve, Armand might infect Landry or rip him apart. Armand had been a very good butcher, almost as good as me. Why didn't you tell her? Armand growled, eyes shifting golden. Because you're her friend and she doesn't have friends. Also, you haven't bitten her, but you will if you keep feeding her. She can drain you empty for her protection, but she absolutely can't sustain a relationship with you. Landry slashed Armand's face with the cleaver, and Armand didn't get out of the way in time. Armand's blood dripped down his chin, which shifted and grew furrier. Landry, you have to stop. My father's voice from the doorway made both Armand and myself freeze. But Landry only clubbed Armin's ribs with his spiked pin. Orion, would you take his right, please? I moved quickly, grabbing Armin's brown coat and throwing it over Landry. Before I grabbed him, we dragged him off Armand towards the door, leaving Armand bleeding on the floor. We kept hauling him out until we got to the CM's car. Merlot was driving, so we held Landry in the back seat. Daughtry, this isn't any of your concern, Landry snarled. You're attacking my son. Landry bucked and snapped his teeth an inch from the CM's nose. He's been feeding her his energy. The CM's eyes widened. How is that possible? You mean she's drained him for defense? No, she's been feeding off him and baking him muffins from that energy. She can feel his butcher energy beneath the wolf, and she has a connection with him. He's going to kill her if he doesn't turn her. My father frowned ahead, concerned. Shall I take you back and let you kill him? Surely there are other ways of dealing with this matter, as serious as it is. He looked over at me. You don't seem concerned. I frowned back at him. I am concerned, but since Armand is terrified of hurting her, of hurting me, beating him up wouldn't exactly help inspire him. Violence isn't the only answer. Landry stiffened up between us and turned his scowl on me. No? What do you think the best course of action is? We should tell her that Armand is a werewolf, I said calmly. My father and Landry both hesitated. Why not? She trusts him, my father said. She can barely connect with me, and I'm the him. She's skittish. Finding out the kind of danger she's been in that we've let her be in, it would be a blow. But the longer she goes without knowing, when the truth comes out, as it will, inevitably, her trust in us would be even less. And you'll tell her that her good friend is a bogeyman, and how many of his kind you've slaughtered. That was Landry. He shook his head, blue eyes concerned. There has to be a way to keep her away from that world without telling her why. I shook my head. I'm not lying to Violetta. And if she decides that she's finished with this world with butchers and she's alone without anyone to protect her, what then? Your brother might be a werewolf, but he's still willing to protect her, determined to keep what happened to her mother from happening to her. She's not ready to face the complexities of our world. Landry's voice shook. How would Violetta react to the idea that Landry was her father? I had no way of knowing. Drop me at Calder. I have reports to go through before hunting. The car turned left at the next corner, Merlot's hearing being remarkably good for someone his age. At the gates, I got out and dropped Landry's arm. I'd have to leave him to duke it out with the CM and without me. So Violetta taking energy from Armand wasn't supposed to happen, and it worried Landry. I frowned as I headed into Teach Sebastian the Art of Paperwork. Chapter 13. Baker. At 3:15 on Friday, after I took the last batch of sourdough bread out of the oven, Orion came in directly to me and tugged on my hand. I laughed while he pulled me outside. Can I take off my apron, maybe change out of my uniform? He looked down at my outfit and shook his head. Absolutely not. The apron. Okay, but we have to hurry. He led me to the left, the opposite from the pool and the garden, towards the enormous garage. Along the wall at the end was an elaborate setup of bottles, buckets, things hanging from the oak tree, and other targets. Okay, stand here. He put me directly in front of a stack of sandbags in the general shape of a man sitting down. He put a knife in my hand. All right. First you raise your hand like so, above your shoulder but not too high. You're going to hold the blade to make a half-spin throw. Front leg forward. Not too far, and relax. He murmured while he shifted his hands to my hips, urging me in the right position. I relaxed against him and he laughed. Not quite that relaxed. Come on. You can do this. I stood up straight with a sigh. Okay. Like this. I threw the silver blade with a sharp point, and it immediately sank into the center of the sandbags, or what I thought were sandbags, but the second the blade hit it, the whole thing started burning. I stared at it while Orion laughed. I turned around to stare at him. What kind of a knife was that? Come on, he said, dragging me over to the flame. He sat me down on a stump and handed me a roasting stick before he pulled a cooler from beneath a bottle I thought was for Target. I laughed at him. This is a picnic? He pulled up his own stump and rifled around in the cooler and handed me a package of high-end hot dogs, the kind we couldn't afford to buy anymore. Really needed to talk to the CM. Orion smiled at me a little bit shyly as he watched me put my hot dog on my stick. Are you cold? I thought the fire would work, but if you still need to get warm, you can take my coat. Of course. I should have thought of that. He hurriedly took off his coat and draped it over my shoulders while I felt much warmer from him than I ever would from a fire or a coat. Thank you. I roasted my hot dog, glancing over at him now and then, our eyes meeting briefly before I hurriedly focused on the fire. Sebastian said that you like the kind with the seeds, Orion said, holding out a bun once my hot dog was perfect. He'd asked Sebastian what I liked. Of course, otherwise he wouldn't have gotten my favorites. I do, thanks. I took it and held it while Orion arranged all my favorite toppings and let his own hot dog burn. I giggled while I watched him pick off black bits with his fingers before shrugging and putting it into his own bun. He struggled to open it, and clearly hadn't ever roasted hot dogs before, not with how the fire was roaring, and not with the way he didn't seem to know how to eat the thing. I put mine aside and helped him, leaning close to split his bread and then looking up to find him staring at me. My heart raced as he leaned forward, so slow until our lips met. A rush of energy flowed through me in that one contact. When Orion pulled away, he swayed a little bit. I moved away from him and focused on the perfect hot dog instead of on my delicious chocolate man. So we're dating? He nodded, his mouth full, hands empty. He'd shoved the whole thing in his mouth. Typical. Does that mean we're going out, like steady? He smiled. I'd like that. You could be my girlfriend. I bit my bottom lip. Oh, I'm not sure I'm ready to give up on you being my perfect stranger. I could be a perfectly strange boyfriend. I laughed and glanced around at the one-of-a-kind picnic/knife throwing set. It's not strange, it's sweet. He studied me. Is it? He smiled suddenly, a beautiful beaming smile that made my heart pound. You're beautiful. I inhaled hot dog and choked for a minute before I got it under control. Thanks. Orion, doesn't this feel a little bit awkward? You mean because I'm feeding you instead of the other way around? I've given you chocolate before. I feel like you're trying too hard. You don't have to. I'm already completely, certifiably crazy about you. I wouldn't let you sleep with my sweater otherwise. That's good to know. Certifiable, HM? That's pretty good. Is it? I don't suppose you have any pink tablets with you. He pulled out a dark bottle and a spoon from an inside pocket of his long coat. I have something even more vile and effective. He took a spoonful, tucked them away and leaned forward to stare into the flames that were still burning merrily. You hit it on your first try. Very impressive. I should have had you wear hard shoes. It wouldn't be a good date if you ended up with stitches. I nudged him and his arm came around behind me, pulling me close. It would be a good date even if we stood freezing cold, throwing knives at moving targets that I didn't hit once. Being with you is enough. He kissed the top of my head and held me close for a long time, until the flame flickered down and the light began fading from the sky. It was after that, when Orion went home with loaves of sourdough bread and a promise that he'd sleep longer than the 2 hours he'd gotten the night before. Anyway, I was heading through the kitchen towards my room when Landry told me that the CM wanted to see me in his office. I wasn't entirely sure where his office was, but Landry didn't volunteer anything else, just focused on his dough like he was beating it into submission. I wandered around until I came around a corner and stopped in front of an older man, multiple scars on his face. Miss Baker, he said with a serious nod. Hello. Do you know where the CM's office is? He nodded again and turned, leading the way. At least I hoped he was, because I followed him without asking any more questions. It was only a few turns later when he left me in front of an arched oak door. I knocked and immediately it opened. The CM gestured me inside, his glasses and pulled back hair giving him the look of a professor more than a professional killer. Violetta, thank you for coming. You don't mind if I call you by your first name, do you? I stared at him. What else would you call me? Miss Baker. No, Violetta is fine. What's your first name? What happened to trying to be quiet? Casper asked, his own voice loud. I rolled my eyes, not that anyone could see. The question is whether we should scale down into this pit beyond the broken seal, or whether we should return with the information we have. They all stopped moving and talking. I just suggested that we all climb down into hell. Why would I do that? I studied the ground with the light and noticed that outside of the 3 seals were overlapping circles drawn into The stone, the section where all three circles crossed in the precise center of the seals. I squatted down on that ground and pressed my palm to the ground. Connection. I could feel them beneath the stone. Only it wasn't the stone that held them back but the seals. Without the other two seals, would there even be a stone floor? Possibly not. I shivered as I listened to the darkness below snarl. And then I felt when it went quiet and began listening to me. We're leaving now, I said and turned, but something was pouring out of the open pit. I took out a special weapon from inside my coat, a kind of crossbow, loaded with energy pulse, and shot at the nearest part of the monster. It was one creature, a gelatinous blob with a multitude of limbs and one luminous. It came out like water, falling upright with a gurgling sound 20 feet above us. The pulse went off then, sending a shimmering wave of light and energy through the creature, which illuminated the enormous cavern that dripped stalagmites 40 feet above. The flash made the walls sparkle blues, greens, and golds before it was suddenly dark, and the creature rotated its eye in my direction. What is that? Sebastian whispered. Mirthith, I answered easily, tossing the crossbow to him. Let me see if I can remember how to kill it. I was obsessed with mythical monsters when I was a kid, and my dad thought I was wasting my time. You couldn't chop off its limbs. Its eye was its only vulnerable point. Threw a dagger at the glowing orb and it went through the eye to the blob past it and began to dissolve. No, that was Cyclops. Mirthith died from dehydration. Fire then. Only the amount of fire required to kill this guy would also kill us. Do you all have holy water? Sebastian shot the thing with the electrical pulse which lit up the cavern. Again, the monster turned, sent a massive limb across the ground like a gelatinous wave. Set heat explosives for count 10. Far side from the ladder, away from the seals. Sebastian, watch yourself. You've left enough blood down here. Sebastian barely dodged over the wave of a limb rolling over the floor. I had my own to avoid, but it was simple enough to duck and roll while throwing irritants towards it that kept it moving towards me, away from the seals and the ladder on the other side. I threw a small vial of acid at the monster. Hissed and bubbled on contact while slightly silvery goo leaked from its broken skin. Casper, don't waste your time trying to cut him. Prep your explosive. Merlot glared at me while he ducked beneath a swipe of the monster's limb. This plan doesn't seem all that well thought out. I shrugged and began counting down. Sebastian moved close to place another explosive practically beneath it, getting his arm slashed by the blob monster. Sebastian gasped from pain at that contact, and then it was time. I took a deep breath and took out a ball of holy water, triggered it and felt the tightness as it exploded around me, the skin of water keeping me balanced. In it, floating around like the other butchers, Casper wasn't in his ball of holy water. The sound of explosion came from far away, but my vision through the water showed the red-orange ball of heat as it shot us away from the creature. I hit the wall, the water tension broke and I fell to the ground, dripping until the heat seared me, drying that side of my body. I lay there, with my hands over my head, the sound echoing through the cavern until it passed and I couldn't feel heat above my fingers. That may have been because I didn't have any fingers. I raised my head and the cavern was empty, nothing left of the blobby monster besides a splatter of goo on the walls. Casper was singed more than Merlot, who was rolling to his feet, rubbing his shoulder, or Sebastian, where he still lay spread-eagled near the ladder. I pulled out a sausage roll and munched it while I headed to the ladder. I tossed a roll to Casper, who ate it with eyes still wide and movements jerky. I grabbed Sebastian by the back of the coat and dragged him upright before I pointed my small device at the ceiling, pushed the lever, and then both of us shot up on the lead string very quickly until with a jerk we stopped, my hair brushing the ceiling. I pushed him to the top of the ladder and he managed to climb up. I followed, and soon Casper and Merlot came after me. I closed the trapdoor and took out another roll, handing one to Sebastian. Before I ate another. How did we get out so fast? Sebastian asked. I pulled out the device, then put it back in my pocket. Butchers have the best gadgets. You're going to love being the butcher. I studied the trapdoor before I walked to the edge of the room and laid down pins and wires that would explode beautifully if anything tried to come out from that side. Gadgets. Sebastian's eyes were enormous in his face, and his nose was smudged. Casper patted his shoulder with his loose fingers. That's right. We also get the best monsters. The girls are never going to believe me. I don't suppose any of you got pictures. I laughed and stood, taking another sausage roll out of my pocket and chewing on it. I wasn't sure what it was supposed to do, but I felt like a king. That plan had been extremely idiotic but had worked pretty well considering. I headed back along the low corridor, hunching down until I got to the cellar and the dusty old jars. It was halfway to the trapdoor when I stopped and held up my hand for the other butchers to stop. I closed my eyes and inhaled. Couldn't smell anything other than ancient dust, but there was something, presence above us. Was it wraiths? Was it vampires? Zombies? Whatever it was. There were a lot. What? I cut off Casper with my hand on his lips and backed us to the small doorway. We'd no sooner gotten there than the ceiling of the cellar caved in. It only took one small explosion to clear enough space for us to crawl out into a confusion of monsters. I tossed rolls to my butchers, pulled out my knives and ran into the horde with a smile. I spun and slashed, feeling the wind in my hair as I slid through the darkness that had no chance of catching me. My heart pounded slowly as I moved, every thrust precise and inspired. I fought with the strength of 100 butchers, every death sharpening the hunger inside me. I fought as one, possessed, my butchers behind me, until a howl in the distance cut through the keening hunger. Werewolves attacked the edges, ripping at the monsters until the darkness fled, broken on my spear point and their harrying. They dispersed while I chased them from the middle of that field deep in the darkness and laughed. Was terribly alive and burning with hunger for another death. They vanished too quickly, leaving me with a rising sunrise in Armand's fist. He hit me in the face, contact I barely noticed even though I tasted my own blood. He gripped my coat lapels and shook me. Are you stupid as well as mad? I kept laughing until he pulled me close and hissed into my ear. And Vanilla? How is she this night with her butcher trying to get himself killed? I blinked and let him put his hand in my pocket and shove a roll in my mouth. Armand turned and walked into the ranks of his wolves, shifting as he went. Followed, leaving the zombies to shamble away. I ate more rolls as we walked, until I could think rational thoughts. What in the world had that been? When I looked back at my butchers, I had to remind myself that they weren't my butchers, at least Casper and Merlot. They were beneath the CM, not me, but they followed me as one connection. Merlot nodded at me while I flinched and turned away. I wasn't wise enough to be a CM, but as the CM no one could tell me how often I could kiss Violetta. My mouth watered and I ate another biscuit and another, but there weren't enough biscuits in the world to stop me from craving Violetta. Was I more mindless after kissing her? I was certainly more enthusiastic. Chapter 7. Baker. Orion wasn't there the next morning, but his friend Casper was. I ignored him. As I baked under Landry's watchful eye still, it was strange to have him loafing around in the kitchen all morning, eating and eating and eating. Landry never left while he was there, and I couldn't help but wonder about the Greek's warning. Casper, I said as I rolled out dough, tell me about vampires. Do crosses and holy water work on them? He finished chewing his bread before he nodded. Crossbows and holy water. Bombs, sure. Oh. I stared at him and thought about crossbows and bombs. What about garlic? He smiled at me, a rakish smile beneath the sweep of his blonde hair. If I found one of his hairs in my rolls, I'd kill him. They don't like garlic. Who does? Vile stuff. They're not crazy about any strong antibacterial oils. Rosemary, ginger, that sort of thing. You don't need to worry about vampires, though. Your butchers will protect you. Butchers in the plural? Who would those be? I didn't ask, I just smiled and pounded on the dough. The weekend flew by in a flurry of baking as several visiting butchers came, visited the kitchen and spoke in low voices to Landry without glancing at me. Well, much. I did catch one or two disapproving glances and a few lingering looks as though they wanted to see whether I could really have brought werewolves back. I didn't pay much attention to it, not when I had vast quantities of food to prepare. On Sunday it was strangely quiet, with no baking in the kitchen whatsoever. I went to Mass with Landry when he invited me, but we didn't go with all the butchers, but to a glorious cathedral downtown with stained glass, a beautiful choir and ordinary people. I sat in my pew and felt a little bit of the stress leach out of my shoulders. None of the congregation were part of that world. They were all ordinary people who were doing their best. Landry leaned over and whispered, "This is what keeps back the darkness. The citizens of our city weren't all fighting back the darkness in their own way. We couldn't do anything but abandon the city and build a wall so high that nothing could come out. I turned to glance up at him, his blonde hair catching the red light of the stained glass, a red halo. Is it possible to build such a wall? He shrugged. Of course. You've heard of the Wall of China. There's another wall built down in South America, Africa, when the darkness grew too great to fight back. Now we are living in a time of such modern wonders and with enough butchers to hold back the darkness on every front. At least most. He frowned for a moment before he gave me a slight smile and turned back to face the priest as he led the procession from the back of the church. I wanted to ask Landry more, like, was there darkness everywhere or only some places, and if so, what made those places susceptible? Were there some places in the world untouched by vampires, zombies, and wraiths? I inhaled deeply of incense and wood polish, smoothed my hands over my pink skirt and listened to the chanting. When we got back to Candlestick, Orion waited in the driveway for me. When I saw him standing there, dressed in black with his long dark hair falling across his slanted cheekbones and delicious lips, my stomach tightened and my heart pounded faster. My mouth also watered, but I didn't want to focus on that. He opened the door for me and took my hand, his fingers warm around mine. Hadn't seen him since Friday. Seemed like such a long time ago. I have a meeting to go to, but I wanted to make sure you're still planning on going to the garden with me tomorrow. Also, he was holding my hand, letting I wanted to stretch on my tiptoes and kiss him, sliding my hands through his silky strands and drown in bliss, but Landry stood there, watching us from the other side of the car. I squeezed his hand back. Of course. 3:45. I wouldn't miss it. I shivered. Half because he was so delicious, half because the cold November breeze was swirling around my bare legs. He frowned and stepped closer until I could feel the strength and warmth emanating into me. Let's go in. Landry, I'll walk with her while you park. He didn't look away and I couldn't break the warm chocolate brown gaze. Didn't want to. We walked into the house and I dropped his hand. There were several older butchers standing around whispering in hushed voices, and the looks Orion and I got together were a bit scandalized. I stopped meeting eyes and instead focused on the gray stone floors until I finally descended the long low steps that led into the kitchen. You can go, I said, turning, but he moved close, sliding his hands around my waist, not pulling me against him but making contact that made me want more. I'm not sure I can. I missed you yesterday. Why didn't you come? He made a face. Research. Seals and mythical monsters, that kind of thing. Inhaled so much dust I sneezed for an hour. At least. I patted his head. Poor baby. So that's what the sausage rolls were for. His smile faded. Endurance, vigor, and boosted senses. Maybe dust as well. Your baking is miraculous. Landry cleared his throat. The meeting is about to begin. If you don't want to be on your father's bad side, you should probably not be tardy. Orion's hands tightened on my waist before he forced a smile and let me go, stepping back, which felt terribly wrong. Tomorrow. The botanicals gardens closed at 5. I was going to meet Orion at 3:45, but I wanted to spend time before that, perhaps follow the path around the pond in the Japanese garden with its twisted bonsai trees. I could watch the koi and maybe think about what I wanted. After lunch, I told Landry that I was finished for the day, and he nodded absently while he rolled out breadsticks. He looked distracted while his hands rubbed the dough back and forth into beautiful long strands he'd roll in sesame seeds. I went upstairs, changed, called a cab on my phone, then went outside, walking down the drive towards the gate where the cab would be. I slipped through the side gate, waving at the guard in his little building. It was automated but still guarded. Was he a butcher? Not something I could ask. I stood there, glad for my jeans and warm jacket while I waited. The drive was uneventful, the cabbie talking about the chances for a good hockey season until we got to the drive that led to the tall glass building, filled with enormous glass flower sculptures in dizzying hues. After I paid the cabbie, I walked in, feeling like my mother might be waiting in the garden for me. She wouldn't, of course, but for a moment my heart rose. Anyway, there weren't a lot of people there that day, and as I walked along the paved path beside the pond, the quiet interrupted by a distant splash of a fish or the rustle of leaves, I had enough quiet to finally work through the thoughts in my head. Didn't seem real. Werewolves, vampires, but I could hardly dismiss the butchers in their candlestick manner. None of them were role-playing. Orion was the most serious and determined person I'd ever met. He'd truly been poisoned, and I truly saved him with Jello. My brother Sebastian had grown into a monster-killing machine, and I was a baker, or at least I could be one if I wanted. I sat down on a bench and stared across the water at the distant bridge and perfectly pruned tree, arcing over the water, its reflection spreading into the sky. My inexperience was a definite disadvantage. I'd fallen desperately in love with Orion while at school, pretending to buy my brother. Now I could still hardly believe that he liked me, much less wanted to touch me and be with me as much as I wanted to be with him. It was all too sudden, too irrational. He was my first love, and while my parents had had a very good marriage, surely my father was not the first man my mother ever loved. They didn't talk about how they met. They didn't talk about much before Bess and I were born, no doubt because of my mother's refusal to speak about bakers or butchers. But they must have talked to Bess, or he wouldn't know to join the butchers. I would have a good long talking to with him. I heard a branch snap and turned to glance over my shoulder into the trees that swayed in the sun. When I turned back, a deeply hooded figure stood in front of me. She lifted her head enough that I caught a glimpse of blood-red eyes before she glanced down and took one ominous step in my direction. I sat there staring at her stupidly while my heart took off like a jackrabbit, and my brain did absolutely nothing for long seconds until she took another step towards me. She moved like water or oil, something inhumanly graceful about her, but I was still processing that flash of face, beautiful yet terrifying, and it hadn't seemed like she had any hair. I sat there feeling like I was going to throw up, paralyzed by fear, and she took another step closer. After another step, she lifted her head and looked at me again, her face deep in shadows but still luminous, beautiful. Child, are you brave or foolish? I frowned at her. I certainly wasn't brave, so foolish would be the only option, but honestly she was walking towards me like a predator, clearly trying to get me to take off into the woods behind me where no one could see her, suck my blood, or whatever she wanted to do. Neither. What do you want? She smiled then, blood-red lips revealing a flash of sharp teeth, fangs included. I think both. You believe that since you can cure werewolves you can survive a vampire. I swallowed. She knew who I was. This wasn't an accident then. How had she found me? I was right about her being a vampire, and I was talking to her. Probably was too stupid. I slipped my hand into my bag and she moved, grabbing my arm in her cold vice-like grip, the smell of old blood on her breath as she hissed at me. I ripped open the lid of the jar with my other hand and pulled out the toothpicks I'd been soaking in oil since my conversation with Casper. Stabbed her in the face with them, feeling far away like my hand belonged to someone else, short practical nails clinging to the little sticks that I shoved into that skin, the sound of sizzling flesh only audible for a moment, before she threw me using my arm as a handle, tossing me like a doll through the bushes and into the dark woods behind the bench before she was on me again. She grabbed me, lifting me up in the shadowed woods, her hood falling back to reveal a very bald head, and her face now imperfect as though she had unsightly acne where the toothpicks had been. She held me by my head, my skull carefully balanced in her hand as her eyes grew red like welling blood. Could see my blood in her eyes, the craving for my blood growing and growing. Something hit her from the side and I went flying again. I tucked and only hit my leg against a tree before I scrambled up to see the most terrifying thing I'd ever imagined. No, I'd never imagined anything like that before. A man-wolf circled with her, his head all wolf, body mostly man with feet and hands of wolf. They moved together in a flash of fur and a swirl of her black cloak before they came apart, the wolf growling and snapping while she gazed at him in perfect silence, not even breathing. I backed away from the two, as quietly as I could with my limping, until I was far enough that I could turn and move towards the nearest wall. The street beyond that would be full of cars and people, and I'd be much safer in the middle of the road than here in the woods. I reached the wall and scrambled up, my fingers strong as I pressed into the cracks until I reached the top. Fell over, rolling down the small patch of grass to the sidewalk, for the moment deserted, but half a block away was an intersection that would be busy with traffic on an afternoon at 2 or 3. I ran, ignoring the agony in my leg, and didn't stop until I was in the center of the road, cars weaving away from me. I pulled out my phone and called Orion with shaky fingers. He answered at the first ring. Violetta. Where are you? I'm in the middle of the road. It's daytime. Why are vampires running around? In the middle of the day? They're not supposed to do that, are they? What? About werewolves? It's not a full moon. It's not any moon. The rules are completely wrong. The only good thing was that the garlic definitely worked. Think I need something other than toothpicks. I thought I was being paranoid. Why wasn't I being paranoid? I don't want to run around with a knife on my leg all the time. Do knives even work? Maybe toothpicks were better than knives. You know, mini steaks and all that. Violetta, take a breath. Calm down. On the southwest corner of the garden. Yes, I whispered while I tried to not be hysterical. I was standing in the middle of the road with something terribly wrong with my leg and I had to be rational, calm. I see you. I looked up in time to see Orion fall onto the sidewalk seemingly from the sky and walk towards me briskly, chewing on something. He smiled at me and lifted his hand, the one that had a roll. My roll? I smiled back and waved. When I stepped towards him instinctively, a car honked at me and swerved while I jumped back and held my breath for a second. With my eyes closed, I was fine. Of course, everything was perfectly fine. Orion scooped me up in his arms and I buried my face into his neck, inhaling his skin and feeling like everything might be truly all right at some point. He sighed heavily and held me close as he carried me in some direction. Probably through cars, but I wasn't interested in watching. I couldn't see anything else. Ever again. I was being an idiot. Dramatic stupid. Yep, I was. I clung to him tighter and pressed my cheek to his throat until I felt him swallow with difficulty. Are you all right? I pulled away to stare at him. His lips twisted and he pulled me back against him. Stupid question. Do you want to talk about it now while I carry you in the general direction of Candlestick, or do you want to wait until we get somewhere safe? He sounded slightly raspy, like I was strangling him, which I was. I loosened my grip slightly and slumped against his shoulder instead of his throat. Aren't I safe now? I feel safe. You were there too quickly. Can you move super fast or something? Landry called me when he realized that you'd already left. He expected you to tell him. He's quite upset about it. He feels responsible for your safety. I pushed away from him because there was something in there, an accusation. And when I looked in his eyes, I could see that Landry wasn't the only one upset. The only warning I had was to stay out of Border Town. The gardens should be safe. That's where my mother worked. I wanted to go early to think and not have to cry all over you. If it wasn't safe, you probably shouldn't have suggested a date there. He studied me thoughtfully. I should have been more clear. You're safe with me. Without me. He frowned furiously and kissed me, his lips hard but his hands soft as they held me, as though I were the lightest thing in the world. Precious, delicate and perfect. I wrapped my hands around him, tangling in his hair while I kissed him back. He'd stopped walking. For a few minutes the rest of the world diminished in importance until a car honked a half-dozen times. I pulled away, turning to see my brother Bas behind the wheel of Orion's car. Another car behind that. Francis at the wheel. Orion sighed. I suppose I should thank them instead of being angry at the interruption. Are you injured? I swallowed and tried not to feel so dizzy and just good from him, but I couldn't help it. I gave him a very small smile. Yes, just my wrist and my leg. Not bad for my first rumble with a vampire. So aren't they supposed to not be able to wander around in the sun? He stared at me unblinking. She hurt you. His hands became iron around me, hard and unyielding until I winced and he softened his grip, walking quickly to lower me over the side of the convertible to the seat. Ba take vi to Candlestick. Don't stop for anything. Francis and I will secure the monsters. I gripped his coat when he tried to pull away. You're going back there? I left them manacled in the shrubbery of a public garden. Do you think that I should leave them there for a gardener to find? I scowled at him. This was supposed to be our big date. I wasn't sure why that came out, but I'd been looking forward to it, and now he was going to go back and I was going to go to Candlestick without him, and with Sebastian. Francis and me can take care of it, Bia said, trying to be helpful. Orion looked at him, an icy glance. No, you can't. I have to take them alive and uninjured to be judged by the CM. We have something called law and order here, and as the butcher I make certain that everyone has their chance at justice. Transporting a werewolf and a vampire like that are not errands for butcher's boys. I trust that you will not get creative with this extremely important errand, that of taking Violetta safely back to Candlestick. Can you do so? He sounded positively furious and Ba visibly withered beneath his glare, but he rallied valiantly. Yes, sir. I can. He shifted down and drove off, ripping my fingers from Orion's coat without any hesitation. I punched him in the shoulder and twisted around to look back at Orion. The way he watched me, his face icy and terrifyingly angry, eyes burning after me, made my heart constrict painfully. I turned and resolutely faced forward. No sense staring at him when he'd so clearly ended our date. Not that I could blame him. I definitely did not want some innocent person to stumble on those dangerous creatures. Vi, don't be mad, Bess cajoled. You shouldn't have gone to the garden without telling anyone. You're important now, and if something happens to you, Orion will probably go on a killing spree or something. I frowned at him. Excuse me? Are you saying that Orion's homicidal and mentally unbalanced as well as psychopathic? He rolled his eyes. Don't be stupid. It's just that's how I felt killing all the werewolves I could, whether they were following the rules or not, because of what they did to Mom and Dad. It's a natural reaction. Since when is murder a natural reaction? Not that it would be murder, would it? I mean, werewolves and vampires aren't human, are they? But then why do they have human girlfriends? I don't know. Why are vampires going around during the day? It was a vampire, wasn't it? She had fangs and everything. He put his hand over mine. Vi, calm down. Tell me what happened from the beginning. I took a deep breath and for a second clung to his fingers until I felt his energy. Automatic guilt had me pulling away. I could not take energy from BS. I went to the garden down by the pond, just sitting on a bench when some cloaked vampire lady came up and started chatting. When she grabbed me, I stabbed her face with garlic-infused toothpicks. That was gross. And then she threw me into the woods, and I think she was going to kill me, but a werewolf came and attacked her. They didn't seem particularly friendly. While they were ripping each other apart, I snuck away, climbed the wall and ran into the middle of the road, called Orion, and he came really quickly. That's it. He nodded thoughtfully. She wasn't trying to kill you or you'd be dead. Also, that she didn't put you under her compulsion probably means that she was trying to be friendly. Friendly? K-12. He grinned at me. You stabbed a vampire in the face with toothpicks? You are so weird. Haven't you heard of knives? Knives don't fit in my bag. You need a bigger bag. I rolled my eyes and sagged against the seat. So, you think that if the vampire wanted to kill me, I'd be dead? Oh yeah, he said reassuringly. Like that was reassuring. Idiot. She's one of the ancient ones, or she wouldn't be prancing around during the day. She must have lost control when you stabbed her face. He laughed and ruffled my hair, hurting my neck. That's funny. I shook my head, but a slight giggle came out. Funny? Not exactly, but ludicrous, impossible, and my brother's reaction completely insane. Now I feel much better. Yeah, see? They weren't actually trying to kill you. You weren't in any real danger. Probably just wanted to talk to the girl who saved the werewolves. You're like a novelty or something. Like the bearded lady. Exactly. Thanks, Beast. I can always rely on you to say exactly the wrong thing. Hey, why didn't Mom want me to know about this world? I could have some coping mechanisms that aren't toothpick related. I could be some ninja warrior or something. He glanced at me, his light green eyes skeptical. You've always been pretty scary with your rolling pin, not to mention chef knives, but you know you're no butcher. I scowled at him. As far as I knew, there were no butchers, bakers either. Why didn't Mom want to tell me? I should have known not to wander around on the north side or in the garden, apparently. He shrugged uncomfortably. She wouldn't say. All Dad said was that being a baker is tough. I thought he meant like physically or emotionally, the whole pouring your energy into baked goods for other people to consume, and you were tired after you baked for me, so I guess it made sense to me that Mom just didn't have enough energy to feed a bunch of butchers. You knew her. She didn't want to talk, she wasn't going to. So, he said, giving me a suggestive look. How are things going with Orion? Is he giving you enough energy? I punched his shoulder. He didn't flinch, just grinned at me. That good, huh? Do you need any help with him? I mean, after you helped with Olivia, she's been much happier with me. I snorted, but actually thought about it. I licked my lips. Do you think I should keep doing this baker thing? His eyes widened. You're thinking about quitting? What about Orion? I was just attacked by vampires on what was supposed to be our first date. This is what they're all going to be like, then I'm done. Maybe I should find somewhere to go to college far away from here. He glanced at me before focusing back on the road. He drove differently than Orion, more careless and unfocused. I don't know. I've always been a butcher. I mean, even when I didn't change over, my instincts were violent and vicious, but always unsated, so that left me kind of grumpy. But it's who I am. Ever since Orion let me into his boys, I've felt at home. You've always baked, Vi. You've always baked for me and Dad, whether you knew about it or not. You're not going to stop. It's not something you do, it's who you are. Think what's bugging you is that you're such an overachiever, and you're not baking and training for a meet and taking 5 more classes than everyone else, and whatever else you do. I've noticed that you seem happy, at least happier than you've been since Mom and Dad died. Landry's pushing you and you're focusing on this baking thing more than you ever have before, except maybe right after the accident. All you did is bake for weeks. So what I'm saying is that you should realize and probably tell Orion that baking, while part of you, isn't enough. That you'll need other outlets because you're crazy. I sighed and slumped down. That was true. Baking was a compulsion for me, and if I ran away I'd still be baking, but give my goods to random strangers like Armand, who didn't give me the strength I desperately needed in return. It was also true that I tended to be an overachiever who didn't know how to relax. I closed my eyes and tried to visualize my perfect future, but my leg throbbed in time to my beating heart. My neck was also bruised and pulled from her, grabbing me as well as my arm. I just met a vampire, a friendly vampire. My toothpicks had only made her angry, and the compulsion thing, so she could have gotten into my head like a vampire had gotten to Mal, turning me into a psycho killer who betrayed her best friend. I should call Chloe. I hadn't talked to her for weeks. She called often right after my parents died, but I hadn't really reached back. I pulled out my phone, scrolled down, and hit her number. It rang a few times, and then I heard her voice, sounding happy and tinny and very far away. Violetta Tansetta, are you kidding me? I thought you had fallen off the face of the earth. Don't say it. You know, I actually met someone who thought the earth was flat, so it is possible. Where there is will, there is way. What are you doing? Going home after a vampire attack. I'm baking, actually. I have a mentor and I'm learning the most amazing stuff. She was quiet for a second. Right, because your brother went to school, so you won't go to college until next year. You're still coming here though, right? I chewed on my bottom lip. This wasn't a conversation I was emotionally prepared to have. To be honest, probably not. She sputtered for a second. Chloe never had a problem saying what was on her mind. It's one of the things I loved about her. You're the smartest, most motivated girl I've ever met. Don't tell me that you're quitting on your dreams. I know it's hard since your parents died, but you can't give up on yourself. I'm not. It's just right now isn't the best time. So you're working in a bakery? I know that you and your mom did a lot of bonding that way, but you're not going to bring her back by baking. I flinched while my heart ached so hard I couldn't breathe for a second. Chloe, I've got to go. Wait, Vi, I didn't mean it that way. I'm just worried about you. You have too much potential. I don't want you to throw it away. Thanks, Chloe. I know. Are you coming to town for the holidays? We should get together. Somewhere there weren't any vampires. Really? Yes. We can do a movie or go shopping or just talk. I'm working on the most amazing project with my advanced chemistry class. You'd love it. I agreed, and then we hung up. I was left staring at my phone with a sigh on my lips. The girl she wanted me to be had died with my parents. I curled my knees up to my chin and wrapped my arms around my legs, wincing when I brushed my left calf. I couldn't breathe for a second. It hurt, in vampires and werewolves. And Orion, and I put my head on my knees and tried to breathe, but the adrenaline was gone. And all I was left with was terror and pain. Hey, it's okay. Bess put a hand on my shoulder, but I only whimpered like a pathetic thing. Vi, it's not a big deal. You're fine. Don't cry. You're supposed to be tough. You know, holding it all together. He drove faster, as though arriving at Candlestick would somehow make everything okay. I looked up at him, at my idiot brother who thought killing vampires was awesome, so much fun. Was there some place we could go and be safe from the vampires and werewolves and whatever had killed our parents? But what about all the innocent people who needed protection? He was like a police officer in the line of duty. What did that make me? A deputy? I closed my eyes and shrunk down in my seat, glad that Orion wasn't there to see me like this. By the time we got to the enormous Gothic manor, I'd found a tissue in my pocket and had mopped up my face. So much for my cute date makeup. Landry was waiting for us at the top of the drive, and before Sebastian had come to a complete stop, he scooped me up and carried me into the house. Landry. I tried to hold myself away from him, but he carried me like he'd heft a bag of wheat or oats. Orion called, said you were injured. It's not a big deal. He raised a golden eyebrow and met my eyes for the first time. His eyes were clearly concerned, and I felt guilty for absolutely no reason. If it wasn't a big deal, you shouldn't mention it to Orion. He might overreact. He carried me through the house like that had settled that, which it hadn't. But the weird thing about Landry hauling me around was that it wasn't weird. Just felt like a sack of flour that needed to be put somewhere. He put me down on the kitchen table, cleared of any baking like it was waiting for me, and then folded his arms across his chest. He did have impressive forearms. Where does it hurt? Oh, here, I said, pointing to my neck and jaw. My arm and my leg. Left calf. I hit a tree. Or she threw me into a tree, but whatever. He pulled out a knife and cut through my jeans from my knee down to my cuff, in one fast movement like he was filleting a fish. I stared at him, stunned. These are my favorite jeans. Do you know how hard it is to find a perfect pair of jeans? He ignored me, instead lifting my ankle in his hand and turning my leg so I could see the welt and bruising that covered it. I stared at the leg, at the fact that it looked a lot like someone had tenderized it with a mallet, and felt slightly dizzy. Man, Vi, that's disgusting. I looked up to see Sebastian in the doorway like I hadn't had worse injuries in my years of gymnastics. No one asked you, bro. Get ice, Sebastian, Landry said in a clipped voice. Get a towel as well. He looked up into my eyes, a frown between his brows. The thing about being a baker is that you are incapable of healing quickly by eating baked goods. The only way you'll heal is if you take the energy of a butcher. She can take mine, Sebastian offered, coming over with 3 ice cube trays in his arms as well as a handful of towels. Landry looked at him with a frown while he considered. He put his hand on Sebastian's face, gripping it for a moment before he shook his head and turned back to me. Your brother's energy is sporadic. You need something richer. Excuse me, but I'll need to take a look at the injuries before they're healed. The CM's voice was deep and low, so much like Orion's, but with a hint of formality that Orion lacked. Landry grinned at me, and I had the idea I knew exactly what he was about to say. Sure, CM. Come on in. He pulled off my jacket, carefully so it didn't get caught on my sore arm. He held my arm by my wrist and elbow, turning it to reveal the print of the vampire's hand. It wasn't only a bruise, but the skin was slightly white as if burned. If you were capable at taking energy as a baker, you could have killed her in this touch. As it is, the reaction from her energy and yours left you burned. He lifted my chin and turned my head back and forth while the CM peered at my neck, jotting down notes before he nodded and stepped away, already having looked over my arm and leg. Hold on there, Landry said as the CM turned. She needs to learn to take energy. Also, if she's not improved before your son sees her, he'll get unbalanced. The CM paused, turned his head to peer at me, his hair neatly pulled back with spectacles balanced on his nose, diminishing the warmth of his brown eyes. Certainly. Landry grabbed my hands and put them on the CM's face. Hi, I said lamely. His energy was like an ocean, rich and dark with endless depths that I could take if I wished. The thing was, I didn't wish. I wanted Orion, not his dad who hadn't really talked to me the whole time I'd been staying at Candlestick. He didn't really like me, even if he did feel like he had to put up with me for saving werewolves or whatever. At the same time, if this was my greatest defense, then I would learn it. I would learn it until I could take care of myself and not have to creep around the edges of this world. Because all I had was a handful of toothpicks to hold back the darkness. I took a deep breath as if I were about to launch myself up and around the uneven bars, my most difficult event. I concentrated on that energy, focused on that force that swirled inside of him and tugged on it, trying to move the enormous mass of it. After a few minutes of struggling, I dropped my hand and wiped my forehead with my arm. Ouch. Wrong arm. Try again, Landry commanded. I chewed on my lip and inhaled shakily. Sure. You can actually get his energy to move? It's so heavy. He raised an eyebrow. Is it? He gripped the CM's face and cocked his head. For a moment, as if listening to something like the mechanisms inside a lock. He was trying to pick. Don't move it, drink it, or drown in it, whichever analogy makes more sense to you. Try again. He released the CM's face while the man with so much wealth and power stood there, as though Landry had commented on the weather or something else as insignificant and ordinary. Do you mind? I asked the CM. If I was going to do this, he'd have to look at me and talk to me. That's what helped with Mal and Olivia if they were focused on me while I focused on their energy. No, little Baker. I don't mind. He smiled, a small smile that was nothing like Orion. Somehow that helped a little bit. He wasn't Orion. His energy wouldn't be the addictive kind that made my mouth water. Don't call her that, Landry corrected. Miss Tansetta will do. I shook my head, trying not to get distracted by Landry. I had to touch the CM myself. I reached out and put my fingertips on his temple before I pulled away and frowned at him. Are you stressed out? He looked back evenly. The season of darkness can be stressful, yes. I bit my lip because hello, stupid thing to say, but I lifted my chin and continued. It's just that I used to take energy from my father, but he'd have me rub his shoulders. Would that be weird? Not at all. He turned and dropped into a chair, leaving the back of his neck exposed. I put my hands on his shoulders, and the lack of skin made it possible to exhale the breath I'd been holding. I closed my eyes and pretended it was my dad. I missed him so much. I buried my fingers in his muscles, finding the tension and releasing it while drawing that tension, that energy into me. Was a little awkward from my position on the table, but after working on him for a few minutes I felt much better. That's good. Probably shouldn't delay the trial any longer. Landry pulled my hands off the CM, letting me come down to earth with a shock. For a moment the grief I held for my father had completely disappeared. I blinked at the CM, who gave me another slight smile. His eyes were warm and serious as he spoke. Violetta, I hope you know that you're welcome here. Very welcome. Sometime very soon we'll have to discuss the conditions of your internship as well as your future plans. He took my hand, squeezed my fingers, and then turned to leave the kitchen with all of us staring after him. Could that possibly be the same person I saw eviscerate 4 zombies in one strike? Sebastian broke the silence with his legendary wit and tact. Landry scowled at him. Are you still here? Don't you have something to do? Butcher's boy. Sebastian got up from where he'd been sitting at the table eating rolls. Yes, sir. He turned and headed out, leaving me on the table while Landry rummaged in his cabinet, the one he kept polar bear placenta tablets in. Yep, he got out that big bottle, but some other things as well. Put out your tongue. I obeyed and wrinkled my nose as whatever potent tincture fell on my tongue. He frowned at me. Shouldn't have sent your brother off. I need to get some herbs from the garden. I'll be fine. He studied me for a long moment before he nodded, turned and hurried out of the kitchen, taking a knife and a metal bowl with him. I was fine. I sat in the pleasantly warm kitchen, the smell of bread baking in the wood stove filling the room while the bitter aftertaste lingered on my tongue. Vampires. I shook my head and gently touched my leg. It looked a little better maybe, but it felt much nicer. Maybe it was numb from the ice. Landry would put a poultice on it like my mother did after I had a gymnastics injury. I missed her so much. When Landry came in and blended up the enormous comfrey leaves, making a paste out of it with oil liberally sprinkled with other herbs, I felt kind of almost like I belonged there. Watching him pause in his mixing to take the fresh bread out of the oven before continuing to mix reminded me of my mother. If he felt like my mother and Orion's dad felt like my father, did that make this butcher world some kind of home? Chapter 7. Butcher. I stood in the Hall of Shame, as my brother and I had always called it, staring forward at nothing with the ancient vampire to my right, as still as a statue and gazing in the same direction I did, Armand on my left staring at me. Every once in a while he'd rub his wrists, the raw red wheels the silver manacles had given him. I should have left them on him. Not that I didn't appreciate him intervening after Voltaire got distracted by Violetta's toothpicks. I still didn't understand why Landry would have called him before He called me once he realized that Violetta should have come down by then and checked the guardhouse. The guard was also in the hall of shame, standing with his head down a few steps behind us, trying not to be noticed. She is brave. Voltaire's voice was like ice trailing down my neck and being lowered into boiling oil at the same time. She wanted it clear that she was using no compulsion. What did she do to you? Armand finally shifted his gaze from me to her. She answered without turning her head. She looked at me without fear. No one has taught her to avoid the gaze of a vampire, or that it's best not to antagonize one if you're unable to finish the job. I gritted my teeth. How dare the cold-blooded monster rebuke me? Armand laughed and slapped my shoulder, squeezing the muscles and bones tight. She's a mouth-watering morsel to be sure, but I thought you were above such things. Voltaire went even stiffer. I did not shed a drop of the child's blood. Armand looked at me pointedly. I'm not sure if the butcher considers that unharmed. I didn't move, not a single muscle on my face. If I moved, I would probably scoop out the vampire's heart. How long are we supposed to wait for the CM? Armand shuffled slightly and bumped into me. I didn't budge. He knew that we would wait until the CM returned, forever if that's how long it took. It had been a long time. The CM had left shortly after we'd arrived, the vampire holding her shackled hands in front of her to show that she wasn't a threat. She must have known the risk of approaching my baker. Why would she do something so dangerous, particularly if she didn't intend a quick kill or a snatch and run? She was a very old and respected member of Bordertown, well, as respected as a vampire ever can be. No mysterious murders had ever been tied to her, and she kept a very close watch on the other vampires in the area, making it clear that she was there in retirement and wouldn't appreciate them stirring things. We stood waiting while I felt stiffer and stiffer with each passing moment. Somewhere in this house was Violetta. What if something had happened to her? What if her injuries were so great that the CM couldn't leave her? I just about decided that I was going to call her Propriety and Tradition be hanged. But the door opened and the CM entered, holding a notebook that he looked at. Instead of where he was walking, he looked unlike a butcher, soft, relaxed, as though he'd been feeding a great deal of energy into a baker. He glanced up as though he heard my thoughts and nodded his head before he finished crossing the hall to stop in front of me. I apologize for the delay. I had to ascertain the extent of her injuries. Let's begin with the first witness. Pack leader, please begin. Our father stood with his hands behind his back, one edge of the notebook visible as he waited for Armand. Werewolves made terrible witnesses. The little crumpet was in the shadowy glade with this sucker dangling by her skull. She should probably see a chiropractor. Continue, the Sim murmured. Armand scratched his chin. He should have shaved and bathed sometime in the past week or two. It's probably my fault that Violetta got thrown into a tree. It looked to me like Voltaire was being overtaken by bloodlust, but surely such an ancient and revered sucker as her would never give in to such cravings. He eyed Voltaire, his eyes flickering golden and shifting slightly. He'd enjoyed fighting the vampire before I'd come along and put a stop to it. Continue. The CM's voice was as patient and indifferent as ever. I attacked and Voltaire through the girl. Do you have anything to eat? How long did you fight? Armand considered. Not long enough for anything interesting to happen. It was really only preliminaries before the butcher charged in, clapped us both in irons and disappeared to rescue his crumpet. Were you injured? The CM bent to take some notes as though that last part was slightly interesting. Only by the silver cuffs your butcher put on me after Landry asked me to rescue the delicious crumpet. If you would stop referring to the person as a consumable, I would appreciate it. The CM looked up from his notebook and nodded. If you think of anything else that might help our case, please do not hesitate. Otherwise, feel free to go. Armand frowned and glanced from me to Voltaire. I'll stay till the end if it's all the same to you, Maker. My father shrugged and turned his brown eyes on me. He still looked suspiciously soft and relaxed. He'd given her his energy and he probably wouldn't have done that if her injuries hadn't required it. They'd been bad. Then she could have been killed by the vampire even unintentionally. She was so delicate, sweet, vulnerable. Voltaire was right. Violetta should be able to defend herself. I clenched my fists tightly and tried not to inhale the scent of the vampire. Your version of events, if you please. Landry sent me a message about Violetta gone missing, so I immediately went to the garden. And you knew she was at the garden how? I didn't let a flicker of emotion show. I tracked the GPS on her phone. Does she know that you can do that? I don't know. He waved his hand for me to continue. I saw Voltaire and Armand fighting, secured them and went after Violetta. How was she? I had difficulty swallowing. She was in the middle of the intersection for safety. She'd looked so relieved to see me, she'd almost gotten hit by a car. Because she'd stepped towards me, trusting me to save her. And then, I frowned at him, the first expression I'd shown. Did he need a play-by-play? Of me kissing her? He waved his hand. After you sent her back with Sebastian, what happened? I removed the manacles from the pack leader and brought the captive here. She showed no resistance. The CM nodded and then smiled at Voltaire. All right, why don't you tell us? Why you approached the butcher's baker, what your intentions were and are. She studied him evenly before she spoke, still in that same achingly awful voice. I wanted to see the child. She's not a child, Armand said for me. I glanced at him and he winked back. I did not punch his face into the back of his skull. The CM gave Armand a quick frown. Silence unless you have something to add to the case. Voltaire inhaled a shallow breath. A virgin as she smells of childhood to me. The butcher's scent was on her, delicate and sweet, but not what it would be if they were mated. The words were lyrical in spite of the intentionally irritating tone. I'd heard her when she was trying to entice. I almost looked at her from the powerful memory of her voice. The CM sighed. Shall we stick to the point? Why did you want to see her? She tilted her head slightly as she gazed at the CM, who looked between her and me. He would never look a vampire in the eyes. The darkness deepens. Something roams the night that gives me the taste of fear. I wish to see the balance, the light, to know how great the darkness will become. The CM took a few notes in his book before he looked up, not directly at her, of course, but addressing her. Have you heard of any slaughtered law-abiding vampire covens? She hesitated, then said, You mean as the werewolves have been exterminated? No, but I feel it is only a matter of time. Someone stirs the darkness. Feel great unease. You feel a lot for someone who's been dead for over a century. Armand sniffed like he could smell how old she was. Maybe he could. I could smell the age on her, the death clinging to her skin with the undercurrent of ancient blood. I meant no harm. The CM nodded while he studied his notes. I understand that your intention was not to kill her, but we are very overprotective of our bakers. If they don't feel safe, the baking suffers. What did she do to you? The vampire stood silent for a long time before she smiled, her blood-red lips curving dangerously. Your baker skewered me in garlic oil. It burned. The CM raised an eyebrow. Did she? Armand opened his hand and held out a handful of toothpicks streaked with ancient blood. Makes me want to know what kind of baking she's been doing. Skewering vampires and barbecuing them. The CM stared at those toothpicks for a long time before he took notes. This is all very simple. You could have requested the protection of the butchers. Instead of approaching our most protected baker, you'll be secured in an unknown location for the period of 2 weeks before sentencing. I stared at the CM, unable to breathe. He would not execute her. Did he ever execute anyone? Everyone would think it was perfectly fine to attack Violetta. Or any other baker. Voltaire had stalked her somewhere Violetta had thought she was safe, somewhere she should feel safe, and she'd ruined our first real date. Armand sniffed and looked around me at Voltaire. Your sentencing doesn't really depend on the CM. You realize that it all comes down to Landry, right? He's kind of unstable. Might want to rip off all your limbs and use you as a scarecrow in his garden, or lower you into the pond of purity and see how long it took to dissolve your bones. Voltaire nodded soberly. I understand. If you require a vampire's assistance in her training, I am more than happy to oblige. The CM looked slightly surprised. I personally found a dagger in my hand. Without realizing I'd pulled it. The CM nodded. I will mention it to my baker. I will personally take you to your new quarters. He gestured elegantly and she nodded as though he were her subject and she his queen before she stepped away from all of us, the CM. Walking behind her, not as relaxed as before, not when he was taking a vampire to the dungeon below Candlestick, the tunnels that ran in a maze beneath the City, silver gates locked every 100 feet or so. She would love it down there, surrounded by silver while holy water dripped down the walls. Armand spun around and went out the opposite door. I only hesitated for a moment before I turned to study the guard. Why didn't you notify Landry that the baker had left? He shrugged helplessly. She's free to leave, isn't she? No one said anything about keeping her here, but I should have realized it. I take full responsibility for the accident. She is too sweet to go wandering the city alone. Sweet. What did he know about it? I turned away from the guard because it was my fault. I hadn't made her realize the danger. I hadn't told the guard to be cautious. I hadn't even told her that her greatest danger wasn't a vampire, but me. When she'd stepped towards me, perfect trust in her eyes in spite of the danger, the cars that wove around her, I'd known my guilt. I headed down the hall, the stairs, and through the kitchen door where she curled up in the old wingback chair beside the fireplace, her bandaged leg propped up on a stool, her jeans cut off at the knee. Landry slapped his hand on my chest before I'd taken more than 2 steps towards her. I looked at him and felt a growl rise in my throat. He thought I wasn't going to see Violetta. He was sadly mistaken. Orion, you're going to take Violetta into the study, curl up in front of the fireplace, watch a movie or whatever young kids do, but your shirt is going to be off, and you're going to take one of these tablets every hour and a half. You're not going out tonight, you're staying with Violetta until she can walk without limping. Understood. Landry's voice was so low Violetta probably didn't hear him. I hesitated because I was too irrational where she was concerned. She would be safer with someone else, but if Landry thought I'd be more useful than harmful, I could not resist the offer of a night with her in my arms, draining my energy until she was as vibrantly healthy as she always should be. Don't you think that'll be a little bit awkward for me to insist I sit beside her without my shirt? Landry smiled a particularly dangerous smile, and somehow I found my shirt drenched in a mysterious substance that I didn't want to explore too closely. It smelled a bit like rotten tomatoes. I unbuttoned it and threw it at Landry, who caught it with a smirk. I ignored him after that, walking to Violetta and dropping down on my knees in front of her. I put my hand carefully on her knee above the bandage before I looked up into her soft green eyes. She was so beautiful. Her features were delicate yet full, large eyes, soft generous lips, offset by a surprisingly sharp chin that gave her a pixie-like appearance. I swallowed as I dragged my eyes away from her lips. Are you in very much pain? Her eyes twinkled as she ran a hand through my hair and leaned close until her forehead bumped mine. If I was, it vanished the minute I saw you without your shirt. Are you trying to distract me? I sighed and picked her up. Her arms came around my shoulder and I turned, walking through the kitchen past Landry, who handed me the revolting pills I had to take. She was so light, so warm and soft, like a kitten, only I'd never actually touched a kitten, had I? Probably not. Where are we going? To the study. I can sit beside you on the couch while we watch the fire or a movie or something. I'm sorry about the date. It's not exactly what I had in mind for our first one. She brushed my cheek with her fingers, leaving a trail of fire and bringing my body alive. I think our first date was actually breaking into my old house. Larceny is terribly romantic. Is it? We could break into Calder and spend the night in the kitchen like old times. She laughed low and husky. That does sound fun. Maybe another time. I entered the room, careful to step sideways so she didn't hit her leg on the doorway. The study fireplace was already crackling comfortably, and the couch had been pushed closer with a gray cashmere throw draped over the arm. Lowered her down carefully, then before I could straighten, she put her hands around my neck and pulled me back down to kiss her. I didn't notice the awkwardness of the position, kneeling beside the couch, my body twisted over her without putting my weight on her. Her lips were sweet, painfully so, drawing my strength in like a river that flowed out of me in a rush of euphoria. She kissed me slow and deep, and I responded in kind, drowning in her taste, the pleasure that swelled and drowned me until I found my teeth on her bottom lip, felt the exquisite skin tighten from the pressure, before I ripped myself away from her, sitting back on the floor while I unscrewed the lid and swallowed an enormous pink tablet that tasted something between ancient vampire blood and broiled liver. When I looked up at her, she was leaning against the side of the couch, her legs stretched out, her fingers resting on her delicious bottom lip. I licked my own lips and tried to smile reassuringly in spite of her wide eyes. Orion, do you want to bite me? I swallowed. Yes. Of course not. But you did this before with the chocolate in your car, do you remember? Yes. Oh, on our second date, the one where you fell into the pond? I do. Remember finding your lips in my teeth. She nodded, her fingers sliding back and forth over her lips where mine had been a moment before, where they desperately needed to be at that very moment. Why did you stop? You look so shocked, as though you did something seriously. Weird, but nibbling is a normal part of making out, isn't it? I stared at her. She wanted me to nibble on her? My jaw ached to close my teeth around the smooth skin of her neck and throat, her shoulder and wrist. Stood up suddenly. I've got to go. It's getting late, time to fight the darkness. If you need anything, call me and I'll take care of it. She raised her eyebrows, pursing her delicious lips while I edged away from her. Oh, okay. Don't forget to stop in the kitchen, you must be hungry. She had no idea. Thank you, Violetta. I bowed at her formally before I turned and nearly ran out of that small room. I grabbed a bag of baked goods before I ran out into the darkness. It was early enough that I walked down to the metro instead of taking my car. Needed to walk, to run, to feel the wind and the cold in the night and not think about Violetta gazing at me with her soft green eyes. What had Olivia called them? Mystic pools in a magical woods? Something like that. Landry had ordered me to stay the night with Violetta. I waited until the train stopped, climbed on board, and then sat the furthest from anyone else, pulled out my phone and called Landry. Where are you? Metro. I had to go. Why? Did you bite her? I inhaled deeply while my stomach churned. I come so close. Far too close. Almost. I left her in the study. Will you check on her? I don't need to. She came in a few minutes ago, told me she was going to her room. She refused my help, so I had to watch her limp up all 27 steps. We need to install a lift. Landry, I came so close. A girl around my age came and took a seat across from me. I looked away from her and turned my body towards the window. I could see my own reflection in the glass. I looked dangerous, hungry, unbalanced, everything the butcher couldn't be. I pulled out a roll and forced myself to chew on it, but what I wanted in my mouth was Violetta. I'll come up with something. There was silence for a moment. If you can't keep it under control, you'll have to give her up. I know. He sighed. If she loses you, we'll probably all lose her. If that happens, I'm not sure how we'll keep her safe. I gritted my teeth. That can't happen. He laughed, but the sound was grim. No, it can't. Happy hunting, butcher. He clicked off, and I spent the rest of the ride tapping my knee, anxious to feel my knife slice through rotting flesh.